In the previous lesson, we set up your environment for PHP development, and then we wrote a single line of code that outputs the text "Hello World." And whenever we looked at the source code, that's all we saw. Now, the code itself comprised of many other pieces. We had this PHP tag, and then we had an echo, and even our hello world was surrounded by quotes. But we don't have any of that in our output. So in this lesson, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the syntax and to see why this is behaving the way that it does. And we're also going to talk about variables as well, because that kind of ties into what we are talking about. So let's first of all talk about our code block. So we can call this several different things. We can call it a PHP tag, we can call it a PHP code block, or just a code block. But as you probably already know, this is where we put our PHP code. If you'll remember from the previous lesson, I mentioned that PHP is both a language and a runtime. Well, the runtime needs to know where our PHP code is, and it looks for these PHP tags. So anything inside of the PHP tags is considered PHP code, and thus it's going to be executed by the PHP runtime. In fact, we can see what happens if we take out this code and we place it outside of a code block. So let's just do that. Let's hop on over to the browser and refresh the page. And now we have the literal text that is what we would normally think of as our code, both the source code and what is rendered in the browser has both of those things. So what is outside of a PHP tag is treated as just normal text. And in the previous lesson, I said that PHP generates HTML, and that is a true statement. But a truer statement would be that PHP generates text. Because, as you will see here in a few moments, we're going to mix PHP and HTML, and that's how we make all of this stuff work. So the PHP runtime is going to execute a PHP file. In this case, our index.php file. It's going to leave everything alone that is outside of a PHP code block, and it's going to execute all of the code inside of a PHP code block. So that's the first thing you need to know about how this works. The second thing is that inside of a PHP code block, white space means nothing. So here we have everything on a single line, and it kind of makes sense to do so here because it's not a very complex piece of code, and it's also very nice looking. And I know that that sounds kind of weird to say, especially about code, but code needs to be as simple as possible. As you are writing your code, even if it's just for yourself in your own projects, you want to keep your code as organized and as neat as possible, because that makes it easier to read, also makes it easier to maintain, because you will revisit your projects many months down the line. And I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. Well, I wrote it. I will always know what's going on. Yeah, no, you won't. So we have everything on a single line here, but we could add as many lines as we wanted. So we could just keep on adding lines. We could add some spaces in between echo and then our string over here, and it will still give us the same result as before. We see hello world, and whenever we look at the actual source code, we see the hello world on a single line with nothing else. So white space means nothing, but we use it to organize and to make our code look neat. Now, we have two things, actually three things going on here on this line of code. The first thing we have is echo. This is a command, or in the terms of PHP and other languages, this is what we would call a function. A function is a piece of code that performs a particular purpose. In the case of echo, its purpose is to output text. So we are saying echo out this text here, and that is, of course, what we see in the browser. And if you remember from the previous lesson, I mentioned that this hello world is called a string. It's a string of characters. And a string is how we work with text inside of our code. So whenever we want to echo out anything or just output something in the response that is sent back to the browser, we can use echo to do that. And that means we can come in here and we can actually add in some actual HTML. So let's do that. We're going to wrap our text with a P element. If we go back and refresh the page, now we see that the P element is there. And whenever we view this in the browser, well, that's going to look the same, isn't it? Let's do this. Let's change it from a P element to an H1 because that at least changes the style of the text. It makes it much larger as well as bolder. And there we go. So we can output normal text, but we can also output HTML. But we can also do it like this. Since the area outside of a PHP tag or code block is considered just text, we could do this. Now, let's first of all break this down. We have an opening H1 tag, we have our PHP tag, and then we have our code that is outputting the text hello world. We have the closing of our PHP tag, and then we have the closing H1 tag. So if you're going to guess that we aren't going to see any difference here, you would be correct, because the result is essentially the same, although whenever we look at the source code, we see that H1 is on a different line than hello world. But as I mentioned earlier, if we're just going to output the text hello world here, and I'm not going to do anything else that would make this code more complex, then it would make more sense to put everything on a single line so that it's easier to read. So now, whenever we go back, let's refresh the page, we now have kind of the same output as far as the actual source code itself, but of course what is rendered inside of the browser is going to look the same. Now, the reason why we see this line break is because we have a line break here. And when the PHP runtime executes, it's going to put the hello world text on that same line. But notice that the closing H1 element is still in line. So in order to make that be on a different line, we would need to add another carriage return. And there we go. So if you want to actually format your HTML to look nice, then you're going to have to play around somewhat. And some developers do that, others don't. I'm one of the latter. I just want the code that I'm working with to look fine. What is actually sent to the browser, I really couldn't care less. Okay, so I mentioned that we had three things going on, and we talked about the echo command. The second thing is that we are passing in this string to the echo function. In the previous lesson, I said that this is a string because it is a string of characters. And while that's true, a string is how we work with text in our code. So I'm going to use the terms string and text or text data interchangeably because that's essentially what we have. A string is text data. So we are passing text data to the echo function so that the echo function can perform its work. So that's the second thing going on. And then the third thing is the semicolon. So we have what's called a statement. A statement is just code that does something, and every line of code does something. In this particular case, we are echoing out some text. So we have a statement, and we end that statement with a semicolon. So the semicolon says to the PHP runtime that this is the end of a statement. So in programming, a statement is just a smaller piece of a larger application. Just like in a spoken language, a sentence is the smaller piece of a speech or a smaller part of a written body of work. So a statement, it's doing something, and it's just a smaller piece of an application. Now, there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about as far as strings are concerned. In the previous lesson, I said that a string begins and ends with a quote. So we have a single quote at the beginning, we have a single quote at the end. If we omit that quote and we save it, now Visual Studio is going to signify that this is an error. That's what that red squiggly line means. And this is giving us immediate feedback saying that there's something wrong here, but let's ignore that. Let's say that we don't have that in whatever code editor that we're using and we refresh the page. Well, now we see that this page isn't working. This is Chrome telling us that the page isn't working. And the reason why is because the server returned a status code of 500. So when you see a 500 error, it's not a problem with the runtime. Well, it's usually not a problem with the runtime. It's usually not a problem with the server. More often than not, it's a problem with your code. Now, this isn't very helpful because this doesn't tell us anything as to where the problem is. And when it comes to programming, we need to know where the problems occur. Otherwise, how in the world are we going to fix it? So in the next lesson, we're going to change that so that we have some feedback whenever we see an error occur in the browser. But thankfully, Visual Studio is telling us where the problem is here. So we can just change our code to be an actual string here, and then the problem, of course, goes away. So now let's do this. Let's take out our code, and let's have an actual HTML document. Although, let's get rid of some of this because we just don't really need that. And for the title, let's say that this is Hello World. And then inside of the body, let's have an H1 element that says this is the title, as if that wasn't apparent enough. And then we're going to have in our code. So as you would expect, we're going to see our content. We have our title, and then we have just our content. And of course, if we look at the HTML, that's what we have. Now, let's do this. We're going to use a variable because in reality, there's really no reason to use PHP code here. We could come in here with a P element, say hello world, and everything would be fine. But the whole reason as to why we have PHP is so that we can have dynamic web pages and websites, so that we interact with a database or perform some kind of calculation, and then that is going to change the HTML that is sent to the browser. That's why we have PHP. So we are going to use a variable, and then we're going to output the value of that variable. So first of all, what is a variable? Well, it's nothing more than something that stores data. So you can think of it as a box, and you're going to put something in that box so that you can reuse whatever you put in that box. And in PHP, you create a variable with a $sign. Every variable begins with a $sign, and then you give that variable a name. And you want to be descriptive whenever you create a variable name, because as you're reading your code, you want to be able to know what a variable is for. So I'm calling this variable name, and then I'm going to assign it my name. You can put your name there or somebody else's name, it doesn't matter. And we are going to echo out our name. Now, in this case, our name variable contains string data. So when it comes to echoing our name variable, we don't have to come in here and specify that this is a string because we already have our string data. So we are just echoing out our variable. If we go to the browser and refresh, we see the result there. Whatever we assigned that name variable is being output in the HTML. But that's not very useful. Let's say that we want to greet whoever is our name. So we can do this. We can add two strings together. The technical term is concatenate. We concatenate two strings together, but it's essentially adding them. So we're going to say hello, comma space. And then in order to add two strings together, we use a dot. Now, many other languages use a plus sign, and that makes sense because you are adding two strings. But in PHP, we use a dot. So we say hello, comma space, and then dot, and then our variable name. That's going to combine those two strings together, and we have hello Jeremy and hello Jeremy. Now, we could also do it like this. If you'll remember from the previous lesson, I said that whenever we create a string, we can use single quotes or we can use double quotes. And the reason why we have both of those is because they do essentially the same thing, but there is a difference. If you use double quotes, you can embed a variable just like that. Now, notice here the color coding. Hello is in the color of a string, And then the name variable is in the color of a name. And this is one of the reasons why I say that you need to try different code editors, because different editors have different features. And as far as Visual Studio Code is concerned, it is smart enough to know that it needs to color these two things differently. Because whenever we view this in the browser, we're going to see the same results. Hello, Jeremy. And if we tried to use single quotes instead of double quotes, we are going to see something completely different. We will still see hello, but now notice the coloring. They both have that orangish color, which is the color of a string. So whenever we view this in the browser, we're going to see hello and then $name. So there is a difference between strings with double quotes and strings with single quotes. The convention is to use single quotes unless if you want to embed a variable, and in which case, use double quotes. Well, in the next lesson, we are going to set our environment up so that we can see errors. Because as I mentioned, errors are very important. When something goes wrong, we need to know what and where it goes wrong.